On the 18th of March 1911, a heavy-set man with round spectacles and a gray mustache stood in a canyon in the Arizona desert, about 76 miles northeast of the young city of Phoenix, and looked up at the largest masonry dam the world had ever seen. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. He had left the office of President of the United States only 2 years before, and now he had ridden out into the wilderness to dedicate the dam that carried his name. It rose about 280 feet from the bed of the Salt River, some 723 feet from wall to wall, built of about 344,000 cubic yards of rough-cut stone. Roosevelt pressed a button, and the first measured flow of water passed through the works. Then he turned to the crowd of about 1,000 people who had come all that way to stand with him, and he said, "If there could be any monument which would appeal to any man, surely this is it." He was right, and yet even Roosevelt could not have told you the half of it. He could not have named the 26 Italian stonecutters who carved the face of that dam by hand, nor counted the Apache men who cut the road that had carried him to the canyon. He did not speak of the men who drowned when the river rose, or of the whole town that had to be built in the desert before a single stone could be laid. This is the story of how a nation reached into one of the emptiest corners of the continent, and, with cable and stone and the labor of thousands of forgotten men, built something that would still be holding back a river more than 100 years later. It is the story of the Theodore Roosevelt Dam, and of the desert it was built to tame. To understand why men would haul stone into a canyon far out in the desert, dozens of miles from the nearest city, you have to understand the Salt River. It came down out of the high country of central Arizona, and it was a liar and a killer. In a wet year, it swelled into a brown torrent that ripped out canal headings, drowned fields, and swept away everything the farmers of the Salt River Valley had built. In a dry year, it shrank to a trickle, and then to cracked mud, and the same fields that had been flooded in spring went to dust by late summer. There was no middle season a man could count on. The land itself was rich, some of the finest soil in all the West. But the water that could make it bloom would not hold still long enough to be trusted. This was not the first time men had tried to farm that valley. Long before the first American settler drove a stake, an ancient people we now call the Hohokam had dug hundreds of miles of canals across that same ground, farmed it for centuries, and then, for reasons still argued over, vanished. When settlers came in the 1800s and dug their own ditches, some of them followed the very beds the Hohokam had cut 1,000 years before. The settlers understood the omen well enough that they named their new town Phoenix, for the bird of legend that rises from the ashes of what came before. But a city that rises can also fall, and by the 1890s, the people of Phoenix knew that without some way to store the water of the Salt River, to hold the wet years back and dole them out through the dry ones, their Phoenix might follow the Hohokam into the dust. The answer, when it came from Washington. In 1902, Congress passed the Reclamation Act, also called the Newlands Act, and it was one of the great turning points in the history of the American West. The idea was simple and enormous. The arid lands of the West could never be settled by private effort alone, because no single farmer or company could ever afford to dam a river. So the federal government would do it. It would build the great storage dams, sell the water to the settlers, and let the payments flow back over the years to build still more dams. The man who pushed hardest for this vision, who believed the government had a duty to make the desert habitable, was the president himself, Theodore Roosevelt. He saw in the dry West not a wasteland, but an unfinished country, and he meant to finish it. Roosevelt Dam was among the very first projects authorized under the new law. It was approved in 1903, only months after the act was signed, and it became the first major project completed under the whole federal reclamation program. It was to serve the Salt River Project, the organization of valley farmers who pledged their own land as security for the cost of the dam. If it worked, it would prove that the government could do what no rancher and no company ever could. If it failed, it would discredit the entire idea before it had a chance to spread. And that canyon, it turned out, was about as hard a place to build anything as the West could offer. The dam site sat where the Salt River met Tonto Creek, in rough and broken country near the Superstition Mountains, about 76 miles from Phoenix. In 1903, that distance might as well have been 1,000 miles. There was no road to the site, there was barely a trail. Before anyone could haul a single sack of cement or a single beam to the canyon, someone had to build a way in. So the first great work of the Roosevelt Dam was not the dam at all. It was a road. They cut it 64 miles through the mountains, blasting shelves out of cliff faces and switching back and forth down grades that would frighten a modern driver. And the men who did the bulk of that brutal labor were Apache. Apache Indians, working for wages in their own country, built the road that made the dam possible. It was finished in December of 1904, and they called it the Apache Trail. The Apache Trail was only the spine of it. By the time the dam was done, the government had spent nearly $500,000 building more than 100 miles of roads into that empty country. Roads to the quarries, roads to the timber, roads to the little settlements that sprang up to serve the work. Nearly $500,000, in the money of that day, spent before the real construction had properly begun, just to reach the place. And today you can still drive the Apache Trail, and it is still, in long stretches, a narrow and twisting road that clings to the canyon walls, one of the few living monuments to the men who built it, though almost no one who drives it now knows whose hands cut it out of the rock. Reaching the site was only the beginning. A dam of that size needed cement, and cement in that age could not simply be hauled in from a distant plant, because there was no plant and no railroad within reach. So they built one. In the wilderness, beside the river, the government raised its own cement mill, using material from the surrounding hills to make the mortar that would bind the dam. They opened quarries in the canyon walls. They strung power lines and built a sawmill. And around all of this grew a town. A real town, with houses and a store and a school and offices. Set down in a place that a few years before had held nothing but rock and cactus and the river. They called it Roosevelt. Everything that a small industrial city needs had to be carried in over those mountain roads or made on the spot, because there was simply no other way. Now consider the thing they had come to build. The Theodore Roosevelt Dam was a cyclopean masonry dam. That word, cyclopean, is worth stopping on. It comes from the Cyclops of Greek legend, the giants who were said to have piled up the massive stone walls of ancient cities like Mycenae. Walls made of blocks so large that later people could not believe mere men had lifted them. That was the style of this dam. It was not poured concrete. It was built of enormous, rough, irregular blocks of stone, sandstone and limestone quarried from the canyon nearby, each block set in mortar, the whole rising in a great curved wall against the river. When it was finished, it was the largest masonry dam in the world, and among the tallest dams of any kind, about 280 feet high and 723 feet long. It was, in a real sense, an ancient way of building, raised to a modern scale. Before we go on to the machines and the men who raised that wall, a brief word. If you value the stories of the forgotten men who built this country with their hands, the road crews and the stonemasons and the laborers, whose names never made the history books, then subscribe to Global Old History and stay with us. What comes next is the story of how they moved stones the size of wagons across a canyon, and of who it was that cut them. The first problem was weight. The blocks of stone that made up the dam were massive, far too heavy for any team of horses to drag into place, and the dam was rising in the middle of a canyon with steep walls on either side. The engineers solved it with cable. They strung 2 great cableways across the canyon, from tower to tower, each one about 1,200 feet long, spanning the whole gorge in the open air. From these cables hung the hoisting gear, and it was this machinery that did the heavy lifting of the entire project. A block would be cut at the quarry, hooked to the cableway, and then carried out over open air, high above the river and the rising dam, and lowered slowly and precisely into the exact place where the masons wanted it. Those 2 cableways were the beating heart of the construction. Without them, the dam could not have been built. Picture what that looked like to a man standing in the canyon. Overhead, a block of stone weighing many tons glides across the sky on a wire, tiny against the cliffs, swinging gently, while far below the river runs on, and the wall of the dam creeps upward course by course. The cableways ran back and forth all day, every working day, for years. They were the closest thing that Lonely Canyon had to the coming machine age. stretched across a wilderness that had known nothing but muscle and animal and river for 10,000 years. And yet, for all their power, the cables only carried the stone. They did not cut it, and they did not lay it. That was still the work of human hands, and of some very particular hands at that. To give the dam its face, the great outer surface of dressed stone that a mason could be proud of, the project needed men who could take a rough block of limestone and cut it true. That is a rare and old skill, and it was not to be found in the Arizona desert, so they sent for it. 26 Italian stonecutters were brought all the way from Pittsburgh, in Pennsylvania, across the entire breadth of the country, to carve the limestone blocks that would form the face of the dam. On the job, they were known simply as the Rock Men. They were immigrants, men who had likely learned their trade in the old country, where cutting stone by hand was a craft handed down over many generations. And they carried that craft out to a canyon in the American Southwest and left it standing there in the wall. The Italians were not alone. There were masons from Scotland, from Germany, and from Switzerland, men out of the great stone-building traditions of Europe, all of them gathered in this one remote place. And around the skilled stonemen worked a general labor force that was, for its time and place, strikingly varied. The roles of the Roosevelt Dam held European-American workers and African-American workers, Mexican-American workers and Asian-American workers, and American Indian workers, drawn from nearly every state in the Union and from countries all over the world. In an age of hard lines and harder prejudices, this dam in the desert was raised by about as broad a cross-section of humanity as the nation could assemble. They did not all speak the same language. They did not all eat the same food or pray to the same God. But they laid the same stone, and the wall they left behind does not distinguish between the hands that set it. It is worth understanding what those men actually did, because Cyclopean masonry is not simple stacking. The blocks were irregular, no two of them the same, rough giants of stone with awkward faces and angles. A skilled mason had to look at a block and see where it belonged, how it would seat against its neighbors, how the mortar would fill the gaps, and bind the whole into one mass that could stand against the tremendous push of a full reservoir. Every course had to carry the weight of everything above it and pass the force of the held water down into the bedrock of the canyon. Get it wrong and water finds the flaw. The wall rose slowly because it had to, one carefully chosen and carefully set stone at a time. The accumulated judgment of hundreds of men turned into a single unbroken thing. The work was hard beyond the easy imagination of our own comfortable time. There was no shade to speak of in an Arizona summer, when the heat in that canyon could climb past anything a man from Pittsburgh or from Glasgow had ever felt. There was dust and rock and the constant danger of the cableways overhead and the long drop below. Men were injured, men were killed, as men always were on the great works of that era, crushed or fallen or drowned. They lived in the town of Roosevelt, or in camps strung along the river, far from their families, and they worked for years to raise a wall that most of them would never see the use of. It is worth saying plainly, on a channel such as this one, that the monument Theodore Roosevelt would praise was not really his. It belonged to them. Remember, too, who was paying for all of this. Under the terms of the reclamation program, the farmers of the Salt River Valley had bound themselves to repay the cost of the dam out of their own future harvests. They had pledged their land as security. These were not wealthy men. They were homesteaders and small growers who had already lost crops to the river more times than they cared to count, and now they had gambled their farms on the promise that a wall of stone in a distant canyon would finally give them water they could trust. If the dam failed, many of them would be ruined. So the men in the canyon were not building for some faraway government alone. They were building for families a hard day's ride downstream, families who were watching and waiting and praying that the thing would hold. And then there was the river itself, which had no intention of being tamed quietly. Construction had begun in 1903. In 1905, the Salt River reminded everyone what it was. Great floods came roaring down out of the mountains and tore through the works, ripping into the diggings and the temporary structures meant to hold the water back while the dam went up. The very thing they were building the dam to stop, the wild and sudden flooding of the salt, nearly wrecked the project before the wall was high enough to resist it. Work was set back badly, material was lost. The river ran through the canyon in a brown fury. indifferent to the plans of engineers, and the men could only wait it out and then begin again. More than once in those years, the desert river came close to destroying the very effort to control it. There is a grim honesty in that. They were fighting the flood by standing in its path, but they did begin again, every single time. That is the part that does not photograph well, and rarely makes the story. The sheer stubbornness of it, the crews going back down into the mud after a flood to clear the wreckage, and reset the forms and start hauling stone once more. Year after year, the wall rose in spite of the river. And as it rose, the project became something more than a dam. It became a demonstration, watched from Washington and from every dry valley in the West, of whether the federal government could really reach into a wilderness and build on this scale. If Roosevelt Dam stood, others would follow. If it failed, the whole grand idea of reclaiming the West might well fail along with it. Something else was happening at the dam that would prove nearly as important as the dam itself. In 1906, Congress authorized the federal government to generate and sell hydroelectric power at the Salt River Project. This was one of the earliest ventures of its kind in the whole country, the national government not merely building a dam, but making and selling the electricity that a falling river could produce. At first, that power served the construction itself, running the plant and the shops and the lights of the little town. But the principle mattered far beyond the canyon. Power made by water at a federal dam could light homes and pump water and turn the wheels of industry. The idea that a great dam should be a powerhouse as well as a reservoir was written into American practice right here, at Roosevelt, years before the more famous dams made it into legend. In the years that followed, the power generated at the site would help to light the city of Phoenix and drive the pumps that lifted water to the fields. A dam, it turned out, was not one machine but three at once. It was a wall to hold back the flood. It was a reservoir to save the water of the wet years for the dry ones. And it was a generator, turning the weight of falling water into electric current that could be sent down a wire to a growing city. All three of those purposes were bound together in the same great mass of stone in the canyon. The men who built it were laying the foundation of a modern city, though from inside that dusty canyon, it must have been hard to see the shining valley their work would one day make possible. Behind the rising wall, the water began to gather. As the dam closed off the canyon, the Salt River backed up into a great lake that spread out through the country upstream, and this reservoir, called Roosevelt Lake, was for a time the largest artificial body of water made by human hands anywhere on Earth. Think on that. In one of the emptiest quarters of the American desert, men had created the largest man-made lake in the world. That stored water was the whole point of the enterprise. This reserve held against the killing droughts. Every acre-foot held behind the dam was an acre-foot that would not flood the valley in a wet spring and would still be there to save a crop in a dry August. The lake was the bank, and the dam was the vault, and the water was the treasure the whole valley had never before been able to keep. The construction ground on through the middle of the decade and into the next, through floods and heat, and the slow, exacting labor of cutting and setting hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of stone. And then, at last, it was done. The final stone was laid on the 5th of February, 1911. After all the years, all the hauling and the cutting and the fighting with the river, the Great Wall was complete. About 280 feet of cyclopean masonry standing across the Salt. The whole of it had cost about $10 million, an enormous sum for the time, and it had been paid for on the promise that the farmers of the valley would repay every cent out of the wealth the water would bring. Now the dam stood finished, and the only thing left was to mark what had been done. That is why, on the 18th of March, 1911, Theodore Roosevelt came out to the canyon. He was no longer president. He had left the office 2 years before, but he had championed the Reclamation Act, and this was the first great child of that law, and it carried his name. So he made the long journey out over the Apache Trail, the very road that had been built to reach this place, to a remote canyon in the Arizona wilderness, where about 1,000 people had gathered in the dust and the sun to see the dam dedicated. It was a strange and a moving scene, a former president of the United States standing before a crowd in the middle of nowhere, at the foot of the largest masonry dam on Earth, in a canyon that only a few years before no wheel had ever reached. Roosevelt pressed a button that released the first flow of water through the dam, and then he spoke to the crowd. He was a man who loved the West and loved the very idea of Americans remaking their own continent, and he looked at that wall of stone and said the words that are still bound up with the memory of the place. If there could be any monument which would appeal to any man, he told them, surely this is it. He meant it as the highest kind of praise, and coming from a man who distrusted idle monuments and admired hard work above almost everything else, it was exactly that. Here was a monument that did something. It held back a river. It watered a valley. It was, to Roosevelt, precisely the sort of thing a great people ought to build. Not a statue to be looked at, but a work to be used. And used it was. With the flood tamed and the drought hedged against, the Salt River Valley became one of the most productive farming regions in the entire West. The water that had been a curse became a blessing a man could rely on, running out to the fields through the canals on a schedule, year in and year out. Phoenix, which had been a dusty farm town of a few thousand people, began the long climb that would carry it toward becoming one of the largest cities in the United States. None of that growth, not the farms, nor the citrus groves, nor the millions of people who would one day live in that valley, would have been possible without a way to store and steady the water of the salt. The dam in the canyon was the thing that made the modern valley. Very nearly everything green in that desert today traces back, in the end, to that wall of stone. The Roosevelt Dam did something even larger than water a single valley. It proved the whole idea. Before Roosevelt Dam, the notion that the federal government could go out into the desert and build a great storage dam was only a theory, an argument on paper. After Roosevelt Dam, it was a fact a man could stand on. The reclamation program, having proven itself here, went on to reshape the entire American West. The dams that followed grew larger and more famous, and the greatest of them, the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River, would rise a generation later as the towering symbol of American engineering. But Hoover Dam and all the rest stood upon a foundation laid at Roosevelt, in that first hard project that showed the thing could be done at all. For that reason, among others, the Theodore Roosevelt Dam is today a National Historic Landmark, honored as one of the works that made the modern West. And here the story takes a turn that most people who admire the dam do not know, and that a channel like this one has a plain duty to tell you. Because the Theodore Roosevelt Dam that you would see if you drove out there today is not, on its surface, the dam that those Italian rockmen carved and those cableways built. The wall of hand-cut stone that Roosevelt dedicated in 1911 is still there, but you can no longer see it. To understand why, you have to jump forward almost 80 years, to the end of the 1980s, when engineers took a hard and careful look at the aging masonry giant and did not entirely like what they saw. The problem was not that the old dam was falling down. By every account, it had stood faithfully for 3/4 of a century, holding its river through flood and drought exactly as it had been built to do. The problem was what engineers call the largest possible flood, and the danger of a major earthquake. Standards had changed a great deal since 1911. Modern hydrologists calculated that a truly extreme flood, larger than any yet recorded, could conceivably overwhelm the old dam, and modern seismologists worried about how the aging Cyclopean masonry would behave in a powerful earthquake. A masonry dam is, after all, a stack of stone and mortar, and while it is tremendously strong under a straight downward load, engineers could not be fully certain it would survive the very worst that nature might one day send against it. And this dam had a whole valley, and by then a great city, living downstream of it. The cost of being wrong was unthinkable. So between 1989 and 1996, the United States Bureau of Reclamation undertook one of the most remarkable pieces of work in the entire history of the dam, though almost no one ever speaks of it. They did not tear the old dam down. Instead, they raised it and they wrapped it. They built a new outer structure of modern concrete around and over the original masonry dam, encasing the old Cyclopean wall inside a new and larger dam of concrete. They raised the height by about 77 feet, bringing the top of the dam to roughly 357 feet above the riverbed, far higher than the 280 feet of the original wall. When they were finished, the Theodore Roosevelt Dam had been transformed from the largest masonry dam in the world into a modern concrete dam, built to meet the flood and earthquake standards of the late 20th century. The cost of that work was more than $400 million. Set that beside the $10 million the original dam had cost, and you begin to grasp the scale of what modern safety demanded. But here is the thing to hold on to, the thing this old history means for you to carry away. The original dam was not destroyed. The hand-cut stone that the 26 Italians shaped, the limestone and the sandstone that the cableways lowered into place, the wall that Theodore Roosevelt called a monument, all of it is still there. It was not demolished, it was entombed. The old masonry dam stands today exactly where it always stood, doing much of the same work it always did, but it is now sealed inside the newer concrete, hidden from every eye, at the very heart of the larger modern dam that surrounds it. This is a hard thing for a lover of old craftsmanship to hear, and I will not soften it. If you drive out to the Theodore Roosevelt Dam today and stand and look at it, you are not looking at the cyclopean stonework of 1911. You are looking at a smooth, modern face of concrete, poured in the 1990s. The beautiful rough stone, the visible proof of all that hand labor, the very thing that once made the dam a wonder to look upon, is on the inside now, wrapped in concrete, and no visitor will ever lay eyes on it again. The Rockmen's work did not fail. It was not found wanting in strength for all the long years it served. It was simply overtaken by a stricter age that could not accept even a small chance of catastrophe, and so it was preserved by being buried. There is something almost fitting in it, if you sit with it long enough. The stonemason's craft is one of the oldest in the world, and its whole promise is permanence. A well-cut stone outlasts the man who cut it, and outlasts his grandchildren after him. The men who built the walls of Mycenae, the ones the Greeks themselves credited to giants, are gone past all memory, but their stones are still stacked upon that hillside 3,000 years later. The rockmen of the Salt River will be remembered, if they are remembered at all, for stone that no living person can see. And yet it is still there. It is still doing its work, in the dark, inside the concrete. In a strange way, that is the deepest kind of permanence a builder can have, to become the hidden core around which everything newer must be built. So what is left of all this, for a man who wants to go out and see it? A great deal, in truth. The Theodore Roosevelt Dam still stands, taller now than it ever was, holding back the same salt river in the same remote canyon near the Superstition Mountains. Roosevelt Lake still spreads out behind it, still storing the water of the wet years against the coming of the dry, and that water still runs down to the Salt River Valley and still makes the modern city of Phoenix possible, exactly as it has for more than 100 years. Whatever they poured over the old stone, the dam is still doing the very work it was built to do in 1911. Millions of people who have never heard the name of a single man who built it now drink and farm and live because that wall is there. And you can still get out there the old way. The Apache Trail, the 64-mile mountain road that the Apache cut through the wilderness before the dam could even begin, is still there, still winding through some of the most rugged and beautiful country in all of Arizona. Long stretches of it remain narrow and rough, clinging to the canyon walls much as they did when wagons hauled cement over them toward the rising dam. To travel the Apache Trail out to Roosevelt is to follow the same hard road that Theodore Roosevelt himself traveled to the dedication in 1911. The same road that those Apache laborers blasted out of the living rock more than a century ago. Of all the monuments in this story, that road may be the one that still shows its age most honestly, still bearing the marks of the hands that made it. But when you reach the end of that road and stand at last before the dam, remember well what you are seeing and what you are not. The great mass in front of you is real, and it is holding back a river, and it has earned your respect. Yet the stone you came to see is not on the face of it. The hand-cut cyclopean masonry of 1911, the work of the Italian rockmen, and the Scots and the Germans and the Swiss, the wall that the diverse thousands raised against the flood, is sealed inside the concrete now, out of sight for good. You will have to see it in your mind, because you can no longer see it with your eyes. Know that it is in there. Know that it is still bearing its weight. And know that it was set there by men who deserve to be remembered far better than they are. That, in the end, is why we tell these old stories. Not for the numbers, though the numbers are staggering enough. 344,000 cubic yards of stone, 723 feet of wall, 1,200 feet of cable, strung across a desert gorge. We tell them for the men. For the Apache road builders and the Italian stonecutters. For the African American and the Mexican American and the Asian American and the European American laborers. For the men who drowned when the river rose in 1905, and the men who baked in the summer heat setting stone that no one would ever think to thank them for. They came from nearly every state and from all over the world, and they left behind a thing that still works, still stands, still gives life to a desert valley, more than a century after the last of them laid down his tools. Theodore Roosevelt was right about one thing above all others. This was a monument worthy of any man. It is only that the truest part of it, the hand-laid stone at its heart, has passed out of sight into the dark of the concrete, where it will likely stand long after all of us are gone, a hidden wall built by forgotten hands, still holding back the river it was raised to tame. If you want more true stories of the men who built the old world with their hands, subscribe to Global Old History.